In 1919, a large crowd gathered at the Jallianwala Bagh Park in Amritsar, Punjab, India. This was the era of the British Raj. The purpose of the gathering was to protest against a set of oppressive laws enacted by the British government. However, what started as a fairly peaceful protest ended in a massacre. At the command of the Brigadier General of the British Indian Army, soldiers opened fire on the protesters, including those trying to escape. Although the exact estimate is not known, it's reported that about 1,500 people were killed, with many more injured. It's been more than 100 years since the Amritsar massacre happened, but the British government is still debating if it should apologise or not. Welcome to Unveiled History. Before World War I, the British had fully consolidated their rule in India. As a result, British India contributed massively to Britain's war efforts during World War I. However, while the British were busy fighting the war, anti-colonial revolutionary movements began to emerge all over India, especially in Bengal and Punjab. In 1915, a pan-Indian mutiny within the British Indian Army was formulated by Indian nationalists in Germany. However, it was thwarted by British intelligence. All of these led to the passage of the Defence of India Act in 1915, which limited civil and political liberties. When the war ended in 1918, the Indian local populace expected that these measures would be eased and that India would be granted more political autonomy. To be fair, the Montagu-Chelmsford Report, presented to the British Parliament in 1918, did recommend limited local self-government. Instead, the British government passed what became known as the Rowlatt Acts in early 1919. The Act essentially extended the measures from the Defence of India Act in 1915 and granted the government the power to imprison citizens of British India suspected of terrorist activities for up to 2 years without trial. The central strategy of the Rowlatt Act was to either contain or remove individuals involved with anti-colonial movements, rather than acknowledge legitimate grievances or any political agenda. So, basically, the purpose of the legislation was for the British to stay in control. Not surprisingly, the passage of the Rowlatt Act led to widespread political unrest throughout India. Muhammad Jinnah Ali, leader of the All-Muslim League, resigned from his Bombay seat in protest, while Mahatma Gandhi called for protests against the laws. The unrest in India as a result of the Rowlatt Act was especially severe in Punjab. In early April 1919, Gandhi called for a one-day nationwide strike to protest against the repressive laws. However, what was supposed to be a peaceful movement turned violent when two prominent Indian leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, were arrested and banished in Amritsar for organising protests against the legislation. The news that these prominent leaders were arrested and banned from the city sparked further violent protests in Amritsar. On April 10th, the people of Amritsar organised a protest at the residence of Miles Irving, the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar. The purpose of the demonstration was to demand the release of the two Indian leaders who had been arrested. However, in response, the military shot at the crowd, killing several protesters and setting off a series of violent events. The crowd, in turn, carried out arson attacks on British banks, killed several British people, and assaulted 2 British women. On April 11th, a British elderly missionary, Marcella Sherwood, who was taking care of 600 Indian children, was attacked by the Indian mob. She was attacked on her way to shut down the school on a narrow street called the Kucha Karachan. Fortunately, she was rescued by some local Indians, one of whom was the father of one of her students. A few days later, after visiting Sherwood, the local commander of the British Army issued an order requiring every Indian man using that street to crawl its length on his hands and knees as punishment. According to him, Indians usually crawled with their face downward in front of their gods, so he wanted them to know that a British woman was as sacred as a Hindu god. Over the next 2 days, following Sherwood's attack, the city of Amritsar was quiet. However, violence continued in the other parts of Punjab. Railway lines were cut, telegraph posts were destroyed, government buildings were destroyed and burned, and 3 more British people were killed. By April 13th, the government had put most of Punjab under martial law. The law restricted a number of civil liberties, including freedom of assembly, meaning that gatherings of more than 4 people were prohibited. Meanwhile, a day before the martial law was passed, the leaders of the Hartal in Amritsar had already held a meeting where they concluded that a protest would be held the following day in the Jallianwala Bagh. On Sunday, April 13th, 1919, the Amritsar local commander, Brigadier General Dyer, was convinced that a major insurrection could take place, so he banned all public meetings in Amritsar. However, the notice was not widely disseminated, and many villagers gathered in Bagh to celebrate the Baisakhi festival. Some of them were not just there to celebrate, however. They were also there to peacefully protest against the arrest of the 2 Indian leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Saita Pal. By mid-afternoon, thousands of Indians had gathered at the Jallianwala Bagh near the Harmandir Sahib in Amritsar. The Bagh was an open area of 6 to 7 acres, about 200 by 200 in size, surrounded on all sides by walls roughly 10 feet in height. This meant that there was only one exit. The ironic thing is that the majority of the people present at Bagh during the massacre were not even protesters. Some of them were pilgrims passing through, while others came to celebrate the festival. Only a few people were actually protesters. Now, prior to this time, the local commander had been notified of the impending protests. Dyer decided to do something about it. Instead of taking action to peacefully disperse the crowd, he arrived at the Bagh with a group of 50 troops. All of them were armed. Dyer also brought 2 armoured cars armed with machine guns, which were used to block the entrance and prevent anyone from leaving. Without any warning, Dyer ordered his troops, who were also blocking the exit, to fire at the crowd. It was a deliberate act. The troops continued to shoot for about 10 minutes, killing unarmed men, women, and children. After the troops had fired about 1/3 of their ammunition, Dyer finally ordered a ceasefire. Later on, Dyer would reveal that the purpose of the shootout was not to disperse the crowd, but to punish the Indians for disobedience. The result of the shootout was horrific. Apart from the deaths caused by the shooting, many people died from the stampede or by jumping into the solitary well on the compound to escape the shooting. After India gained independence, a plaque was placed at the well which states that 120 bodies were removed from the well. After the shooting, Dyer imposed a curfew time earlier than usual. This meant that those who were wounded could not be moved, and so many more died of their wounds that night. Following the massacre, the British government tried to suppress information about the massacre, but news spread in India and widespread outrage ensued. The Amritsar massacre caused many moderate Indians who had been loyal to the British to abandon their loyalty and made the nationalists increasingly distrustful of British rule. After the massacre, Dyer reported the situation to his superior, Lieutenant Governor O'Dwyer, who approved his actions. In the following days, thousands were detained by the British Army and they were sentenced to penal transportation. According to historian Harish Puri, at least 115 people were killed by security forces in the days after the 13th of April. However, both the British Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill, and former Prime Minister H.H. Asquith openly condemned the attack. Churchill referred to it as utterly monstrous, and Asquith called it one of the worst, most dreadful outrages in the whole of our history. In spite of the open rebuke against Dyer, many Britons still thought him a hero for saving the rule of British law in India. In October 1919, the British announced an inquiry into the events that happened in Amritsar. After weeks of examining witnesses, including Dyer, the inquiry concluded that Dyer's actions had been inhuman and un-British, and had greatly injured the image of British rule in India. However, no disciplinary action was imposed on Dyer because his actions were condoned by his superiors. In 1920, Indians demanded compensation from the British for Indians whose family members were killed or maimed as a